continue the conversation since there is a symposium going on, Student as a Career, I believe, in this building. So those people who want to be students as a career, they may join. But let me frame this a little bit before we go to the discussion by saying that if someone would give a paper here about, say, Mein Kampf, Hitler's well-known 1920s book, it would give a certain kind of tension in the air, as it were, because everyone has some idea about what Hitler did and what actually happened. So to historically place this particular text in the 1920s is a hard thing to do in relation to what happened, as it were. And that kind of tension or reverberations are not so much present here because that kind of historical consciousness is context related, as it were. So if you would give a paper in India, like Janaki has now done, it would be very, it would arouse a lot of interest and objections, and that has to do therefore with that where she ended, with what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, killings of Muslims, taking the idea of Punya Bhumi, this idea of the sacred land of India, so literally that mosques built in the 16th century had to be erased from that landscape to make it indeed into a Punya Bhumi, into a sacred land. So this is a little bit of the context of why this is an important text and an important kind of intervention in the historiography, but also that we can never really completely innocently read these things because they are always implicated in the politics of today. So that's, I think, one thing which needs to be said here. When you go to the university library to read Mein Kampf, you have to have actually special permission from the librarian to read it. Because here it is seen as a defamatory text, as an anti-Semitic text, of course, and therefore as a dangerous text which can be used by right-wing groups for nefarious purposes. Now, this is almost the case with this particular text in Utrecht. So I think that puts it a little bit in a kind of context. What Rosie always does in these lectures is to first ask questions for clarification, and I think that's very useful because maybe some of these issues are not very well known, some of the terms. And I just give an example of a word I was puzzled with, which I think is neither Hindi or Marathi, but is English, I think. Rapine?
Rapine. It's an old English word.
Okay, and what does it mean, rape?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
okay.
Like looting, rapine.
Okay. No, I'm pretty sure it's, but I've never heard it before, so it is a word which may need some clarification. Yes. But this kind of questions, not only of words, etc., but are there things which really escape you, which there's no reason to be ashamed of that, because it basically would make entire sense. Is there anything which you want to ask of a more, say, let's put it like pedestrian level?
I'm not sure I understood the Sanskrit and the...
Oh.
Sorry, it's really 101.
No, that's okay. The Asindhu Sindhu Paryant, that the one in Sanskrit
shows that a lot of people would have those references.
Yeah.
Like how does that fit in?
Well, Asindhu Sindhu Paryant is a word in say colloquial Marathi, right? Until when, you know, Keha Paryant, until when you would ask in Marathi. So Asindhu Sindhu Paryant is it would be immediately recognizable. That it goes from the Sindhu to the rivers, to the ocean. Until then, Paryanta. Yasya Bharabhumika, that is also, that would be, Yasya is there is. That in some colloquial form or another, Peter knows more about some of these things than I do. I'm not by any means trained in Sanskrit. And that was the point, in fact, that I could read this with zero training in Sanskrit, right? I could understand it. But of course, if you put it to a Sanskritist, they would say this doesn't make sense. This doesn't follow any of the sort of, you know, linguistic or sort of scholarly protocols of writing in Sanskrit. Punya, again, a word which is in modern Indo-Aryan languages is sacred. Punya Bhumi is earth. Cha is also, you know, this is something that I think if you were growing up in India in the 1920s, if you were growing up in India, you would have had some kind of Sanskrit learning. Even when I grew up in India, right, and I went to school, I studied Sanskrit until about 10th grade. I couldn't do anything with it. I conjugate verbs, and I could say, I'm going home, when are you coming? And that was about it, you know, in Sanskrit. Yes. But it's also that in, you know, in the late 19th century in Maharashtra, a number of key Marathi intellectuals do something that happens across several other linguistic communities in India, which is they Sanskritize the language, that they try and purify it. And Marathi is actually, if you were to Sanskritize it, you land up with the kind of Marathi that Savarkar will write. So I find his Marathi very difficult to read, because he doesn't use colloquial Marathi. He doesn't even use the colloquial Marathi in the 1920s. He uses a hyper-Sanskritized prose. But here, he doesn't. He actually, it's like Sanskrit light, you know, L-I-T-E. And you would immediately get Punya Puja Pitrapu and Hinduriti Smriti. Hinduriti is Hindu behavior. Okay? It can be used interchangeably with that. Smriti is sort of respect. So there is more than enough that without knowing any Sanskrit at all, you would figure out what was going on in this passage. Which is interesting because, you know, it's one more of those kinds of contradictions in this text. In the 20s, there are people who are writing about things that I wrote off in my first book, in the book on music, but they're actually going in the opposite direction. You know, they're sort of rewriting things in Sanskrit as a way of legitimizing themselves. So, in my previous book on music, there are entire volumes that one of those two modernizers of classical music, the two work together, it's modernized and classicized, at the same time, writes didactic books entirely in Sanskrit, okay? More or less the same, I mean, older than him, somebody 30 years older than him, but writes the whole thing in Sanskrit, right? And has a great self-consciousness about why he wrote in Sanskrit. And is asked, you know, if you wanted to make classical music readily available for everybody, why would you write in Sanskrit? And he says, well, I've written this in Hindi as well and in Marathi as well, but unless you write in Sanskrit, you don't get taken seriously. And Savarkar clearly comes out of that kind of tradition, except not with that kind of Sanskrit. You know, his Sanskrit, the earlier person who I worked on, that Sanskrit passes muster. This Sanskrit does not pass muster. And even Hindutva has no, shall we say, analogs, right, in Sanskrit. I don't know if any. Nor is it that kind of abstract noun that you can see in other treatises like Kashmiriyat, right, which Kashmiriyat is as an abstract noun descriptive of an attitude or a culture of the peoples of Kashmir. That has an older history. Hindutva is a neologism. He pulls it out. It's, you know, and I mean, in today's India, to call somebody a Hindutvavadi is, depending on your ideological persuasion, either to give them a great compliment or, you know, or to sort of call for pistols at dawn. I mean, no, it's.
I wonder whether there isn't a sort of I'm thinking analogically, which is wrong, of course, but in the 1920s, as fascism was taking over in Italy, there was a whole generation of poets that Latinized the language, which was really Latin enough. That Nunzio comes to mind, inventing not only absolutely imaginary landscapes of this country that is, of course, the heir of the great Roman Empire and antiquity, but doing exactly the same thing on language, very, very pompous, completely fake, syntactically, lexically, grammatic language, which obviously works wonders. There is a tendency to fascistize the language. There is injections of both a grandiose vision of a past, which then is projected on the landscape. And to read it today is like a tragedy. You think, how could this you've got people literally inebriated. You could project it. I mean, if you read the Nunzio on the Italian landscape, you think, oh my God, how could not every
part of this.
Part of this. So I wonder whether there isn't something of a rhetorical strategy, which is a political one as well, and could actually be looked at comparatively.
I hadn't looked at that. I mean, Savarkar certainly read Mazzini. You know, that was, I mean, Mazzini translates Mazzini, in fact, as a very young man. It's interesting to me when I read him in Marathi, because Savarkar is generally, by the way, one of the other things about Savarkar is that many people write about Savarkar, but they don't read Marathi. And so they read a sort of a scattering of texts on him, but they don't read him in Marathi. At 1924, which is when Savarkar actually publishes this book, he's released from prison, and he's released into house arrest until 1937, after which he comes out, and then he becomes the president of a Hindu nationalist party, which is in opposition to the Indian National Congress, and he's president until 1942, from 37 to 42. But when I read the book, there are two things which are interesting. One is that in 1924, when he comes out, having written Essentials of Hindutva, there is almost immediately an entire commemorative literature about him in Marathi that begins at the same moment. Now, it's a commemorative literature that begins about him before he's dead, long before he's dead, right? But it's a literature that martyrs him from 1924 onwards. And after 1948, when Gandhi is assassinated, that literature then takes on a different tone. But the sort of literary output on him in Marathi is also typically not read. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is read my way through all of that work. I remember Ashish Nandi had given a paper, and he said something about nobody has ever written a biography of Savarkar. And I thought, well, I've got about 80 of them in Marathi sitting on my desk. Okay. And, well, plenty of people have read them. They only, plenty of people read them, but they actually function in a different kind of context. But the other thing I was going to say about, which you had started out by saying about Mintu, is that even as a young boy, you know, he has this sort of world historical sense, or at least he has in his own narrativization of his own life as a world historical life. That's more precise, actually. He gives us, or he gives his future readers, a very self-conscious sense of hubris that he will then put into his writings. And his sense of hubris in terms of wanting to educate the young lads in his region into a world historical sensibility. And the only way that that world historical sensibility could be introduced to young lads in the places that he lived in, Bhagur and Nasik, was by having them read certain kinds of biographies of Napoleon, of Mazzini, and of Garibaldi. Okay. And Mazzini's text is in fact translated in Bengali, Punjabi, and Marathi. And it is translated by Lala Lajpat Rai into Punjabi, I think by Bipin Chandra Pal into Bengali, and by Savarkar into Marathi. And this trio is sort of, not exclusively, but it's certainly a trio of something, of sort of, you know, sort of key figures in what is known of as extremist ideology. What struck me when I read this was that, you know, did I go on too long? I don't know if I went on for longer than an hour, but I cut plenty of sections out. Is that Savarkar starts this text by referring to Romeo and Juliet. Yeah? That's how it begins. The fair maid of Verona, when asked this, that, and the other about her name, and then goes on to say, what's in a name? All right, let's see what's in a name. See what happens. I mean, I've got a passage here on what's in a name, which you might be interested in. He says, what's in a name? Ah, he says, call Ayodhya, which is the, you know, eponymous place of the epic hero Ram from Ramayana. We'll call it Honolulu, he says, or nickname her immortal prince, Honolulu's immortal prince, Apuba, or ask the Americans to change Washington into Genghis Khan. Okay. And he saves, for the last, he says, persuade Muhammad to call himself a Jew, and you'll soon find out just what's in a name. Okay. That's his opening salvo, right? So he starts with Romeo and Juliet. So that's what sort of alerted me to the fact, why on earth would he start with Romeo and Juliet, for God's sake? Well, of course, the name arose by any other name, but also because it's the love theme, you know, that sort of keeps coming back. You know, in Savarkar's other works, you would wonder whether he's in love with a submarine. Yeah. He writes of a submarine, like he's in love with a submarine. In the course of writing this paper, I remember calling a colleague to say, "Did you tell me some other works in which an author sounds like he's in love with a river? You know, a river." Now, it's not that the Ganges is not written about in poetry, in Indian poetry, but it's like all erotic energy is sublimated into this, you know, and it's sort of present, it's on the surface of this text. It's not that far hidden that you can't find it. But in the process of sort of invoking Romeo and Juliet and talking about love and a name, he also says Hindutva is not just a name, it's an entire history. So in effect, what he manages to do is, it's a very grand historical gesture of appropriation. Whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, leftist, rightist, moderate, immoderate, liberal, anarchist, revolutionary, he fixes you as a Hindu, as a political Hindu. You know? So that the fact that I despise his politics, nonetheless, is, you know, I've been brought into his fold by virtue of this kind of naming process. And Gandhi doesn't do this, and Nehru doesn't do it quite so, and none of the other nationalists do it, and sort of trying to understand why this text, which is a very bizarre text, it has no rhetorical cohesiveness. It's a series of, you know, sort of assertions that are about passions and rage and sentiments and sublimation and desire, and why, in fact, a text like this should have that kind of longevity. You know, I mean, Hind Swaraj hasn't become a sort of, you know, abstract noun, and Discovery of India hasn't, and Hindutva has. And you know, I was trying to ask it more in terms of its seduction rather than hate.
Narcotics and love.
Huh? Narcotics and love. Yes.
Who else? I don't really lots to ask, I guess. So, go ahead. Jeff?
I don't know this. So, I mean, I really, really admired your rhetorical analysis. I thought it was fantastic. And, but having said that, I know that this depends on where we focus. We're working on particular things. But I thought, you know, in a sense, you overstated the Gandhi versus Savarkar thing, and in a sense, re-ified and reiterated something which many of us are trying to get out. I mean, just to give you an example, I work on a woman called Ruqya Sakhawath-Hussain, who wrote in the 1920s and who was taking a whole variety of very pluralistic emancipatory positions. You know, writing about, for example, the peasant revolts, writing against oppressive landlords who called themselves Muslim while were oppressive, and she was a practicing Muslim. She was bringing together Hindu, Muslim, and Brahmin women. She was certainly part of a modernizing formation, and she was certainly not, even today, if you said Ruqya is a part of political history, people would say, oh, hang on, no, she wasn't. She was an educator, which immediately brings into question issues of the private and the public, etc. And in the 1920s, there were so many options that people were playing with. There were other panisms, there were communalisms, Islamic internationalisms were not all the same. I mean, things like the Sogat, for example, the journal Sogat, were playing with notions of modernity in Islamic worlds, which were not necessarily Islamist in the sense of being for Khilafat, etc.
Sure.
So, I mean, it is not a critique. I understand that this had to do with your focus, but I just wanted to raise this point.
You know, you're absolutely right, and that's an excellent question. The large project is about trying to think about what an Indian intellectual history would look like. See, we don't have that in India. What we have is political history. We have nationalist history. But the idea of sort of coming up with something called an intellectual history, and that's a long-standing project that I'm part of, a workshop on it. And in some ways, Gandhi is the ghost that hovers over everything. It's very, very hard to get away from Gandhi. Try as you might, you can't get away from him. My point in this is actually to not to deify Gandhi by any means, right? And I might land up doing it willy-nilly, but the point is to actually not have Gandhi be so completely at the center that every other conversation is subsidiary, is to actually locate the fact that in the 1920s, and I'll answer your other questions in a bit, in the 1920s it's actually very difficult to make certain kinds of separations in political terms. Again, it's very hard to say this is liberal politics, this is radical politics, and so on and so forth. It's under the sign of colonialism, those hard and fast categories actually disappear. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when I say that Gandhi does not refer us to the nation, there are some interesting connections here. So Syed Ahmad Khan, for instance, right, makes an argument about territory before the founding of the Indian National Congress, which is actually quite similar to some of the things that Savarkar will say, right? We are born and we die on this soil. And so, even earlier, the idea, okay, what Afghani was saying, Syed Ahmad Khan had reacted to that as early as the late 19th century. Madani will in fact go on in the 1930s in his vision of a certain kind of composite nationalism to pick up some of the things that Savarkar was writing and say, in fact, I agree that territory is the issue. And on that ground, Muslims are actually more territorially Indian than are Hindus. And he comes up with a wonderful reason why. He says that, Hindus believe in reincarnation and they are cremated. And who knows where they will show up again in their next births and next lives, okay, or in what form. But we, as the Muslims, we are buried here, we are interred here, and this is where we will stay. Some part of that argument is made in 1948 by Maulana Azad. Okay, it's made in the speeches and in his exhortations at the time to Muslims to not go to Pakistan, right? And he says, this is the territory of my Islam. This is the place of my worship. So, in part, I'm saying that Savarkar's rhetoric, of course, inaugurated a certain kind of territorial nationalism. Yeah? The second part of it is that Gandhi is inescapable. I mean, I've tried to write without Gandhi. Okay. But in that sense, it's like the endeavor, if you will, to write colonial or the history, the post-colonial endeavor, right? To write without Europe. And the ghost of Europe is simply not one that by any act of will I could dispel, any more than by an act of a certain kind of gesture I could dispel Gandhi. You can't dispel him. And so the question then is, how do you locate him in a particular kind of intellectual history? And now I get to the first question you asked about sort of whether or not these are political figures or not. And, are you familiar with Quentin Skinner's book on Hobbes? Hobbes is written. There are, of course, parts of that argument that one can pick at, but the argument is a very nice one, which is that in some ways an intellectual history must also be a literary history. It has to. You can't make some of these separations. What kind of text is this? Right? Who is Savarkar? 10 volumes of writings in Marathi, which include plays, poetry. Okay? Savarkar's self-fashioning is that of a poet. Right? His self-fashioning is that of a poet. Somebody who had memorized the poetry of figures like Moropant, somebody who had memorized the philological work of V.K. Rajbari. Someone who is writing in an idiom, I would say, along with Gandhi, which is completely at a tangent to the canonical ways of writing in British English. It's no accident, for instance, that it's only after 1936 that a certain kind of Indian nationalism hits the world stage with Nehru's autobiography. Because he writes in an idiom okay, which is far more acceptable than this Mother Ganges and Father Thames on the one hand, or Gandhi's work, which is incredible, right? I mean, when you read Gandhi, it's enormously frustrating, because in part he writes in parable form with a moral at the end, but he writes not with any sort of readerly, he does not write with any sense of his readership. He writes what is in his head, and if toilets are what is in his head, then for month after month after month after month you will read about toilets. And in that sense, I think you also have to see, or at least this is the argument that I'm making, that you can't conceive of an Indian intellectual history by demarcating between the political and the literary, that you actually have to change that a little. Which is why I was sort of taken a little bit by what Skinner does with the Hobson book, which is sort of demarcates between a hermeneutic domain and the domain of something that he calls what the action of the words. We can say that Skinner doesn't actually ever tell us what the actions are, but yet he makes that demarcation, which is not that you can simply strip aside the rhetoric and get to the meaning, you know, that the hermeneutic rhetorical exercise is a far more implicated one. And so that's why, I mean, I take your charge and I'm guilty that, you know, about Gandhi, but it's very difficult to write this without Gandhi.
I have complete sympathy with the literary political aspect of the methodology.
More on the literary and the political. One thing I think is a gender question. I think this wonderful phrase of Punya Bhumi, Peter Bhumi. Why is it fatherland? And why is there this kind of typically Indian male love for the mother, which is you don't even have to be Freudian to see it as a huge kind of cultural phenomenon. Suddenly juxtaposed to this idea of fatherhood. Yeah, so you have Mother Ganges, and I've always been puzzled by that. Actually, it makes no sense to me. So what is the gender dimension in this whole stuff?
Yeah, just an annotation on Father Thames, because David Ackroyd.
Father Thames, yes.
David Ackroyd is biographer of London, I happen to be argues that that is how the Thames is perceived as a masculine god from way back, which is rather unusual for a river. But proudly masculine and proudly, yes, proudly male even, and consequently very fertile in its own maleness. It's in London's autobiography.
Okay.
Thank you.
And this masculinity of the Brits as opposed to the effeminacy of the Southerners, there's a very big role in their claim to be Vikings and these strange monkey things.
Yeah.
Certainly the maleness of the river, which apparently goes way back. I just wanted an annotation because I was also very puzzled by it.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, the standard explanations for this is, and I don't quite know how to answer that question, Peter, because it seems to me that you're asking me to explain on behalf of Indian men's attachment to their mothers. You know,
you don't have to explain that. It's simply a fact.
But so, on behalf of India, I can tell you that I find it equally incomprehensible. But you know, it's interesting here what he does. So the sort of standard explanation here is that as a young lad, he's taken with the sort of worship of Ashtabhuja Bhavani, right? Kali, the whole and Mother Goddess, yes. But the masculinity aspect comes in here, I think, in regional context. And the regional context is the manner in which I think previous historians, some of whom are his heroes, install Shivaji as the figure of a certain kind of, and I would, in a separate chapter, in what I'm calling sort of guerrilla Brahmanism.
Who is Janaki?
I'm sorry, 17th century chieftain who in fact wanted to be part of the centralized Mughal empire and is sort of taken down a peg as being a little too unruly as centralizing empires and emperors. as I want to do, but takes off and establishes his own kingdom, crowns himself king, engages in a whole series of Brahminic rituals to sort of give himself a princely genealogy, without which he would not be able to have Brahmin rituals conducted for him. And there are some important Marathi literary figures, once again, right? How do you make separation? Who was Rajwade, for instance? Well, Rajwade was a philologist, he was a historian, he's an essayist, and you know, all of those genres sort of come together. And there are two figures in particular. Peter, I am answering your question about masculinity. I know that I'm slightly long-winded, but I answer it.
In the Savarkar
in the Savarkar way, I answer it. The two figures are, I think, juxtaposed. One is Ramdas, who I imposed here, Sant Ramdas, who is a sort of mendicant, but a militant mendicant, if you will, and Shivaji, who is the guerrilla leader. And I think there is, if you will, a sage's militancy and a militant sagacity, yeah, between Shivaji and Ramdas. And these two are sort of installed into a very, very conscious imperial Maratha history, which is a regional history that brings these two together in the service of claiming a certain kind of autochthonous position for the Marathi language, for Maratha history, for the Maratha Empire. And I think that's the masculinity that Savarkar draws from, so that the masculine figure is always Ramdas and Shivaji. Ramdas and Shivaji. And if, you know, Rosie's just answered the Father Thames question for me, but I mean, it's an interesting one. I will go back and read that. I'm not familiar with that work. David Ackroyd, you said, yeah? Yeah. But because I found Father Thames very peculiar, very, very peculiar. I also found feverish and frigid very peculiar.
That's brilliant.
Feverish and frigid.
How could you be feverish and frigid?
Well, cold fever is
Yeah.
actually something that people say.
It's spot on, it's the British down
So do I answer your general question, Peter?
Not really, but let's have some more questions from anyone else who wants to join the conversation. On rhetoric, I mean, rhetoric is all amongst us, so it's probably one of the main things what politics consists of, and therefore politics is always a kind of theatre, right? So it's a performative theatre, and when you are in a prison, you can't perform very well. So basically, his writing must also have to do with his lack of possibility to address audiences and to move around like that politically. So, but the style of this whole stuff. Yeah, to me it's awful, I think. I think it's such a swollen, swollen rhetoric, we call this kind of thing. And so this is also this exaggerated, kind of heated stuff, which probably is much more around than you have to look at it probably comparably at, say, Maududi, who calls, say, secular universities, slaughterhouses. I mean, Maududi is the guy who founded the Jamali Islami, which is a kind of example later for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It's a sort of major figure in the Pakistani politics. It's one of the major fundamentalist Muslim leaders in, say, the 1940s.
But 20 years after this.
True, but I mean, it's just a rhetoric, because that's where you look at. You do a lot of work on the text itself, and I wonder whether this is kind of common feature of these kinds of rather isolated, rather in themselves, heating themselves up kind of language, and whether we can say something about these kinds of styles. There's no direct audience here too. You say Gandhi is not writing for an audience. What kind of audience
is he writing for?
What kind of audience is he writing for? Well, he's using English, which is really an important element, because as you say, he's usually writing in Marathi. So English is suddenly national language, a language to express this strange concept of individuality. But can you say a little bit more about, say, comparative rhetorics in India, or in India and Britain? Read, for example, Powell's River of Blood speech in 1964. Rivers of blood will flow in England because of the presence of all these people from Asia, especially India, all these immigrants which will destroy our land and whatever. I mean, when you read it, you think, oh, this is such a stupid text. Nobody can like this, but definitely some people liked it, and it was around. So,
well, in the 30s, Gandhi does this, right, when he's in England. In fact, when he goes to the Second Arctic Conference, and he makes his famous Ganges will run red with blood. You know, which is kind of Gandhi, it's why it's, you know, it's all of a sudden you've got the Ganges running red with blood. He does this at his birthday party, right, to the assembled crowd. And I think the rhetoric question is interesting. You know, I'm doing a little more work on sort of Marathi rhetorical traditions and whether this comes from that kind of rhetorical tradition. Certainly one tradition that precedes Savarkar is Tirak, of course, Tirak, which is this sort of extraordinary rhetorical ability, you know, to saying about the Indian National Congress, for instance, that we will accomplish nothing if we croak once a year like a frog. I mean, these are things that, you know, Tirak would say. And he was even more extraordinary in Marathi with this, once again, very canny sense. Tirak is one of the sort of major extremist leaders. He's a hero for, you know, and here Gandhi comes back, right? So Tirak is a hero for both Savarkar and Gandhi, right? On opposite ends of the spectrum, shall we say. And, you know, he had this sense about when to ratchet it up and when to tone it down. So when he was released from prison, for instance, his own newspaper wanted to publish the headline saying that he had been released. And in direct opposition to the sort of Sanskritized version, his editor brought him a newspaper with the headline saying, "Tirak bandha mukta zhale," okay, which is bandha mukta is liberated from mukti, and bandha is in confinement. Bandha mukta zhale. And he changes it, and I'll say it in Marathi and then translate it to say Tirak sukle, which is the event, which is like the equivalent of saying, Tirak is now imprisonment liberated, yeah? To say Tirak got off. Tirak's out, okay? It's that kind of prose. So one precedent is certainly Tirak's prose. But I think the other precedent is Chikurkar. And this is a figure in Maharashtra who starts a very, very fiery and polemical, particularly sarcastic style of writing, which emerges in, I would say, Marathi Brahmin speech, which actually has its own name. It's called Chikurkari Varan, which is, and this is what sort of a hyper-Sanskritization of Marathi does, which is it throws in 3 retroflexes in one single word, for instance, you know, which makes it almost impossible to pronounce. But Chikurkari Varan was, or is, this sort of way of turning things around. And so, for instance, here I play native informant for you for a second. If in that kind of sarcastic Marathi, which I find impossibly rude, but never mind that, if you were to say, I'm just making this up, right? But if you asked a guest who came into your house, would you like to sit down? The retort would not be thank you, but it would be a counter retort, would you prefer me to stand? Okay? Or something like that. You know, it's that sort of counter-sarcastic constancy. When I read Savarkar's Essentials of Hindutva, I think some part of this is simply Marathi written in English. Okay, some part of it. So Father Thames, Mother Ganges, you know, and there are other things in here that to me are places where he's writing for a Western educated Marathi population. How did this book get out, by the way? I mean, I tried to do some research on how this book was circulated, who read it, how many copies. Those things are impossible to find. You can't find it with Gandhi's publications. So you don't know, for instance, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj in Gujarati, how many editions, how many. In part because a lot of this falls under the purview of what today we would call vanity publishing. You know, it's sort of published out of people's houses. It's also a period in which all of these books are banned, so they distribute surreptitiously. This one is smuggled out. You know, I thought, wait a minute. You know, he's brought back in 1921. He's brought back and he's moved thrice in 3 years. Okay, so he spends a year in each jail, right? And he writes this finally in Ratnagiri, but before that he was in Pune, and before that he's in another jail. How did he do this? How did he get it out? Did he get it out page by page? Did he send it? Who did he send it to? And it's very difficult to trace some of these things, even though it's in the sort of 20s, in the 1920s. Partly because subsequent editions are just reprints, or they are corrected without annotation. So you don't know whether it's a critical edition or a reprint. Anyway, but I went from rhetoric to this, the idea that this is a sort of rhetorical tradition that goes back in Marathi that has some of this in it.
There's also an element of rhythm, of
Yes.
speaking with the Lurs. With the Lurs of Woody Allen, and Woody Allen says that every time he hears Beethoven's ninth, he wants to invade Poland.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I know.
Which is one of the greatest lines.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
How rhythm works, if you use it personally, in this completely turgid, ugly prose of invented territories and reinvented past. There's a really subtle, superstitious rhythm that comes in, and it's very narcotic. It's very difficult to actually resist. If you let go, which we've done in our anti-denazification drills in post-war Italy, you actually see that your feet start marching and something happens. And it's the nonsense of the lexicon and the syntax actually is compensated by an overdose of sheer rhythmical genius. And that is that would explain why so many people go for it. You're chanting it, you're dancing it,
Absolutely.
It hums, it's a refrain. It's really narcotic. It's very dangerous stuff.
Yeah. Because there's so many. I mean, I gave you, one list, and I gave you one example of the alliteration.
Why don't you sing this one?
I'm not singing. I was very determined that I was writing about music as a historian. Not as a musicologist, not as an ethnomusicologist. And this one, I was certainly not singing this one. But it's interesting that you should say that, because it was one of the things that struck me too about it. That, these are incantative lists. They're recitational lists. The way he moves back and forth between alliteration and rhyme, those are the passages that I think you could sort of take out of this work and simply memorize that one. And any one of these passages would do the job. Any one of them.
But also these lists.
The lists are...
they are very typical.
Yeah.
They have been there since forever. Also Buddhism is... You get really fed up with all these lists. And Chinese do it also. So you have these long lists, and they are all basically getting your body in tune with something. And so, indeed.
Well, so many Sanskrit prayers. I mean, all of the ones that I know, not because I've turned into a Hindu fundamentalist, but because, it's difficult to today be culturally Hindu and having some of these things told to you.
Prayer also.
All prayers.
It's always a good thing.
Very good, yes. But, Vishnu Sahasranam, for instance, you're just reciting names, after names, after names, after names.
It's a very common practice. That's not strange here, actually. These lists are very normal. I think they are very, very normal. But they are inserted in a text which is a little bit different.
Yes.
So the difference and the kind of continuity is interesting. So he has these lists. That makes perfect sense. You would have endless examples of that. But you get it as a kind of device for kind of imagining the nation. and the territory, which is in itself also not a strange thing, because all nationalism is romantic.
Yes.
So it always is about land. It's always from, say, head onwards.
And the violation of any textual conceptual rigor.
Yeah.
They attach anything to anything as
Yeah.
long as the
Yeah.
So it is also very, very sacrilegious. You're
Yeah.
supposed to
Yeah.
attach the trend to being counter-to-reliance to just anything. It should
Right.
be framed, but then, so it's in fact profoundly irreligious in a very deep sense.
So it's a kind of secularity which is
Yeah.
performed in this, it's not religion,
Mm-hmm.
so it is so-called secular, but it's as secular as Zionism is secular.
Yes, yes, indeed. Indeed.
So it's in the same kind of little combination of
Yeah.
religion and
Yeah,
territory and
absolutely.
ethnicity and territory.
So why would you call it secularity and not profanity? I mean,
Profanity. Yeah.
You're saying it's secular because it actually violates the integrity of a certain textual and religious coherence.
Yeah.
It's actually a violation. It's
Yeah,
profanity.
Yeah.
I mean, to associate it with secular is interesting. It's not a possible definition. But
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's the way also Orthodox Jews respond to Zionism.
Yeah.
They find it a profanity, not a secularity, a profanity.
Christoph Baumgarten gave a really good paper
Yeah.
on secularism and profanity and sacrilege.
Yeah.
Thin dividing line. It's on, I think you should be on the website.
I write this down.
Okay.
Sorry.
This is going into press in about a month, so
No,
anything I
it's
can
not
do.
for you. It's
Yeah.
for ongoing conversation.
Yeah, no, indeed, but I
You
think
know,
that is a very important point.
But you see, the difference for me is that in some ways, what has happened with this text, right, is that it is precisely what Skinner talks about, which is its rhetorical power has been stripped, and the way it has been approached, I think, is that it is read as sort of a straightforward politics of fascism. I'm not denying that part, right? I just think that a claim like that doesn't tell us anything about the operations of the text, or why it was successful, and the other part of it is, you know, the striking thing here is that this is his first work that he writes. He writes it in prison, and he writes it with no real people. But, you know, if it were just him doing it, that would be fine. Except, of course, the real people are being written about over and over and over and over again by Gandhi. By Gandhi. And so here you have, in fact, the person who, look, by 1922, Gandhi is now a force to be reckoned with when he comes back from South Africa. Right? 1913, 1914, when he returns from South Africa, he's not really anyone other than someone who has actually been away from India. He's coming back at the age of 50. I don't think that, at least from my reading of that period, that there's any inevitability to Gandhi's coming back and doing what we were told in high school he did, which was, you know, the whole sort of history of Indian nationalism is given to us in one line. Gandhi came back from South Africa and led the masses to freedom. You know, like the masses were sheep or something, and they just there was a door and Gandhi took us there. The more I work on Savarkar, the less inevitable Gandhi seems at one level, not least because from the time Gandhi comes back, right until 1942, the pattern with Gandhi is the same. Gandhi's pattern is that of a salvation seeker. Gandhi's pattern is to speak constantly of failure. So when he calls off the first phase of the non-cooperation movement in 1919, okay, calling it a Himalayan blunder, he does something like that over and over again, which is that the blunder is something that he will claim is his blunder, but it's never really his blunder. The blunder is that he misrecognized Indians' readiness for something. Well, he will do that again in 1922. He will do that again with the Gandhi-Urban Pact. He does that again, you know, in 1937 when he claims that the socialists are taking over. So with Gandhi, you see this in and out movement out of the Indian political scene, right? And at every one of those moments, his contemporary, shall we say, nationalists, right? From South India, whether it was Periyar, whether it was others like Savarkar, whether it was Ambedkar, wrote him off. And there was nothing in that moment to suggest that he would come back, right? There were elaborate preparations made for his funeral on more than one occasion, right? Now, Gandhi being Gandhi frustrates in many ways. You know, I would say 1942, when he goes on a fast, the colonial government is completely prepared for a funeral, he doesn't die. Okay. And this sort of happens. So it's written at that moment where Gandhi's inevitability is far from apparent, you know, and yet he's taken over the Indian National Congress, and yet when he comes back from South Africa, he's actually the only Indian nationalist leader who has led a minority struggle to some success in South Africa, right? So he comes with, quote unquote, some real experience, and yet his nationalism doesn't refer you to a nation. He speaks very bizarrely about you know, the British. He speaks simply about people. And you know, while this now is taken in particular ways, I think it's one of the first sort of important texts to actually do what it does, which is sort of against Khilafat and against Gandhi, and even against, you know, the concept of Hindutva, to sort of refer you to a territorialized nation.
I think that is a wonderful statement. Since we are living in secular time, I think this is the moment to thank our speaker and wish you all good luck. Thank you.
Now we're going to